why have we chosen this topic, media, social media, and democracy? As Bindu mentioned right at the beginning, media plays a critical role in our democracy, Indian democracy and democracies around the world. We use these terms very frequently and often loosely. We use the term media loosely, we use the term social media loosely, we also use the term democracy loosely. So for the benefit of everybody, I would like to define in very broad terms what we mean by democracy. Okay, so by democracy, we are talking of two concepts. We are talking of a system, and we are talking of a belief system. So we can talk of the idea of democracy, but we also talk about a system of democracy. The system of democracy is a country, a state, where power is held by elected representatives. So whatever the body is, so if we talk of democracy in a country, it is power held by elected representatives, MPs, for example, in a state, MLAs, and so on and so forth, including quasi-judicial bodies, including perhaps even the alumni association. So we have democracy in different forms, but as a system, it is when power is held by elected representatives. But how is it also a belief system? It is a belief system because for democracy to work, there needs to be the belief that everyone in that country or the state has a right to express their opinions. Now, the philosophy underpinning democracy is critical. It is critical because without the belief system, it would just be a meaningless process. So a lot of you may be lawyers, senior advocates, and perhaps law students as well. And I also see there are a lot of journalism students attending. But I would like to define democracy as it is written in Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 21 states that the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of a government. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government, and this will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. So this is Article 21. And then there are three further prongs, and it talks of the will of the people expressed by elections, which is the process. And there, again, you are breaking it down into a couple of factors. For example, if you have elections, but you have elections once in 20 years, is the will of people expressed by elections, is that genuine? No, the process fails because there needs to be a reasonable period, and universally, the reasonable period has been defined to be anywhere between 2 years and 5 years. For example, in India, it is 5 years. But then in times like this, times where we live in today, where we have a global pandemic, what happens, for example, for countries or states that were required to go to elections during this period? During a pandemic, is it possible for all societies, all cultures, all economies to have elections during a pandemic? So these are the kind of questions, foundational questions that we need to ask ourselves when we talk about the will of people expressed by elections. The second procedural element is universal and equal suffrage. Now, universal and equal suffrage, what we mean is that all adults in a country or a state have the right to vote. Now, this may seem very obvious to us, and in fact, India has been far more progressive than most countries in the world. We, as you are aware, by virtue of the Constitution of India, we had universal suffrage from the year 1950 onwards. Now, if you compare with certain other countries, for example, Switzerland, Switzerland, they achieved universal suffrage only in 1991 completely. If you look at the United States, it was 1965 through the civil rights movement that they had universal suffrage. And Canada, also 1960. So if you actually compare yourselves against now some of the leading lights, the biggest democracies in the world, and the most advanced countries, India has actually done a tremendous job in achieving universal suffrage right at 1950. And the final procedural component of the definition of democracy is that it's by secret vote or equivalent procedures. Now, where media intersects with the definition of democracy is in two of these four prongs. Having elections regularly is something that India has done from the time we were a republic. And we've really had no, apart from the period of time when Mrs. Gandhi had the emergency, we really didn't have a complete breakdown of, at least at the union level. Questions will be asked about what is happening in Jammu and Kashmir, but that is not the purpose of this discussion. The second procedural, which is universal equal suffrage, again, India scores high marks on that. We've had universal suffrage since 1950. But where I think India struggles is in getting the authority based on the will of the people. How do the people of the country choose to vote for a particular representative for them in our democracy? And that is where media comes in and plays a huge role. Because without the people of the country having a will or having the ability to decide and to choose who to vote for, the procedural elements of democracy actually become quite meaningless. And so, for those of you who are social science students, political science students, I will take you back to the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau for the concept of general will, which is volonté générale for those of you who know French. So this is the first prong. This is the belief system, the will of the people. It's the will of the people that is expressed in elections. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau defines the general will of a population as such. He says, when the people, being furnished with adequate information, held its deliberations, the citizens had no communications with one another. The primary role of the media of a country is to enlighten the public, is to provide adequate information to the general public so that when they go to vote, they're voting on the basis of a reasoned, well thought out decision. And it's very important for us to understand this concept because it goes to the root of the one person, one vote concept. One person, one vote, which means every single voter. And there's a reason why, and as law students, as lawyers, there's a reason why you need to have the age of majority to vote. It's because there's an assumption that you have the mental faculties to process information and based on that information to cast your vote. So one person, one vote means each and every individual in our country, there is a requirement and there's the obligation of the media is to ensure that there is enough public information to allow him, her, or them to be able to take a reasoned decision. Why is this important? This is very important, and this plays particularly into the concepts of identity politics that we have, because the moment we are voting en bloc as a caste or as a community, we are actually giving away the right to the one vote, one person concept, right? Because it becomes a community vote. It is no longer an individual vote. So you vote as a block, you vote as a caste, you vote as a community, you vote as a linguistic group. You're not voting as a person, which is a fundamental flaw in a democracy which is as diverse as India. So very, very important to understand, the basic concepts of general will as defined by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, because each individual needs to be empowered in our country to know that their vote counts, which means it is incumbent on them, it is their duty to gain as much information as possible to allow themselves to make informed decisions at the ballot box. And who better to play that role than the media? The media's role is to enlighten the public. So what the media needs to do is to verify information, verify the truth, seek the truth, and to report it. The fundamental duty of a journalist is to enlighten the public with reporting the truth. And that is the basis on which journalism and the media becomes a forerunner of justice and a foundational stone of democracy. Okay, so what is the role of the media? You verify information before reporting it, you use original sources, you provide context, you update information during the life of a news story, you consider the source's motives before promising anonymity, which is why it's every time I see in newspapers anonymous sources, very suspicious. In a court of law, what would anonymous sources, what would be the value in evidence if you have anonymous witnesses? Right? So it's very, very similar in the journalistic world. The Society of Professional Journalists have said that journalists should be very, very hesitant to include news reports where the source is not disclosed. Because once the source is disclosed, there's an opportunity for the accused, as it would be in a court of law, and similarly, the subject of a news story to defend themselves and to cross-examine, and which is why there's an other principle of natural justice, that everybody needs a right to be heard, an opportunity to be heard, and which is why when there are any allegations made against somebody, while we get the police version, do we also get the accused version before reporting it? That's one of the principles of journalism which I believe perhaps have been eroded to some extent in democracies all over the world. There is also this critical role of the media to be watchdogs over public affairs and the government. This is, again, a critical role, to be watchdogs of public affairs and government. The term watchdogs, maybe we use it so often that we've forgotten the analogy. Now, this watchdog actually belongs to the public. The watchdog belongs to the public. Now, the public has elected certain people to positions of power in government or government agencies. And the watchdog is actually, the dog belongs to the public. And it's the job of that watchdog is to just watch its suspicion, what that public authority is doing, what that elected official is doing, and then to bark or bite if they do something wrong. Now, unfortunately, when you lose media independence, right now it's very difficult to see whether the media is the watchdog of the public or if it's a watchdog of the government. So that is, it's very, very important. As journalists, we train our students, irrespective of the political party in power. The role of a journalist, the role of a media house is to serve as a watchdog over public affairs and the government. There is another role of the media, which is to provide voice to the voiceless. So even if you look into all our news reports, we often want to interview the chief minister, the prime minister, the star of a movie, the leading sports person. But there is incumbent on every media organization to give voice to the voiceless so that every aspect of our democracy can be represented, particularly when people go to vote. It's not just one issue that is consuming the collective conscience of the entire 1.4 billion people every evening at 9 p.m. during prime news. Now, in a newspaper, this is very easy to achieve. It is very easy to achieve in a newspaper because when you flip through the pages of a newspaper, it's all news, except you have a lot of advertisements, but otherwise it's all news. except when you come to the middle pages. Then you have the op-ed, you have the opinion pages. So it's very clear for you when you read a newspaper, okay, this is an opinion of somebody. And the rest of this newspaper is news. You have city news, you have state news, you have national news, you have international news, you have sports news, you have entertainment news. It's all news. And then you have those 2 pages, which is opinion. But unfortunately, in television journalism, you only have opinion and it's presented as news hour. Okay? So do you see how dangerous it is? People are consuming opinion as news. And people are slowly drifting away from reading newspapers and going straight into opinion, which is very, very dangerous, and which is one of the cornerstones of ethical journalism, which we try to train our young journalists to achieve and make a difference in society. The other, so the primary purpose of journalists is to enlighten the public by seeking the truth and reporting it, and we've gone through the ways in which they can do it. The second role is also to minimize harm. There's always a balance, when people apply for an injunction, there's always a balance of convenience that you weigh. Similarly, media houses need to weigh the benefits of providing the information to the public with the potential harm that disclosing that information will cause to society. So that's where compassion comes in. How do you disclose the identity of juveniles? Do you disclose the identity of sexual crime victims? So there are so many legal aspects of this, and they all come together. And in fact, it was one of the decisions for me to start a journalism school came because of my training as a lawyer, because I realized that there is so much need for the law to work together with the media together to support democracy. This principle of minimizing harm is also, it comes into question when you balance a suspect's right to a fair trial with the public's right to know. So we've seen trial by media. And as lawyers, a lot of you, this is again a big, big point. To what extent does the public need to know some of this information? And to what extent does that affect the ability of the subject of the news story to have a fair trial? And finally, the role of the media is to act independently. And why does it need to act independently? It's very similar to the judiciary. It's to have credibility. The judiciary needs to be independent so that there is credibility in the mind of the people. Public trust is paramount for the judiciary. If public trust, why do we have contempt of law proceedings in our country today? So that in the eyes of the public trust in the judiciary should be unwavering. Justice should appear to be done and done. So when it comes to journalism, it's the same thing. If you look at 40 years ago, the level of public trust that media persons had, when a journalist said something, it meant something. It meant that they were only aligned to the truth, not to any political party, not to any ideology. They could equally criticize one party and criticize the other party. They could serve as watchdogs irrespective of the party in power. Unfortunately, today, media has become like a cricket match. So you have one set of media people supporting one ideology and another set supporting another, and public trust in the media is at an all-time low. Thankfully, public trust in the judiciary is somewhat higher, but it's the same principle. If the judiciary is no longer independent, if the press is no longer independent, public trust gets diminished. And again, what that means is the people of the country suffer because they don't have anywhere to go for reliable information. Today, I ask you, if you had to get reliable information from any news organization, which organization would that be? Now, you will probably struggle to answer that question because you will know that if you go to X outlet, you will get information which takes facts and presents it in one perspective, and if you go to Y, it's in another perspective. And that shouldn't be the way a media organization works. It shouldn't be the way that the judiciary works. Absolutely independent. Now, the judiciary is largely able to do that because the structure of the judiciary is designed to be independent. Now, the media was that way as well until you had private ownership in media houses. And so today, media houses are controlled either by advertising their advertisers. So a huge portion of their revenues are met by advertisers. Now, if just taking a name, if L&T contributes to 20% of a newspaper's income, would that newspaper be able to hold L&T accountable? Now, similarly, across the country, state governments, central governments, and this is not a recent phenomenon, it has been there for the last 40, 50 years, governments tend to be the biggest advertisers in newspapers, local newspapers. So your biggest client for a lot of newspapers is the government. It could be a state government, it could be a municipal government. And then what happens is, if you are critical of the government, then very suspiciously, advertisements stop flowing to the particular newspaper or news channel. So it's inherently the business model of media houses are ripe for corruption because they need to survive. Ultimately, they need to pay salaries, and ultimately they rely on advertising income. But media houses have been extremely greedy. I don't think this is unfair to say, but the large groups like the Times of India have taken corporate corruption to a completely different level. So you would be surprised to know that in return for advertising space, Bennett Coleman Company, which is the parent organization of the Times of India, takes shares in companies that are doing IPOs. So the newspaper company is invested in organizations that are advertising in it. And it's incumbent on them to keep the share price up because they make more profits. I don't think this would happen in any society in the world, but it happens in India. And I think there's a big case to be made for legal reform surrounding advertising in media to make sure that our democracy is vibrant. And what we see today, so when you see a big news article about a company, you have to ask yourself, is that a genuine news article or is that paid? Has somebody paid for that story to be planted? And unfortunately, that's the reality today, where there is no distinction between advertising and news. So if you take these three constructs of the role of the media in democracy today, and look at it in our context, when you look at newspapers, still, by and large, we're in a good place because there are editorial processes and like we discussed, just the nature of a newspaper makes it much easier for us to spot where is an advertisement, where is news, where is opinion. But television is a different ballgame altogether. But thankfully, if you look at the statistics of penetration, and this is very, very critical for all of us today. If you look at the statistics of the penetration of media in our country, we have approximately 425 million people who read newspapers in our country, which is not bad at all. And it's perhaps one of the few societies in the world where newspaper readership has been growing globally. So 425 million, which is roughly half of our electorate, still has access to newspapers and reads from newspapers, which is great. Now, where I'm actually very encouraged is that if you look at television news, while televisions reach 67% of households in our country, only 7% of television programming is news. In the sense, only 7% of the people who watch television actually follow news programming. And this is very, very encouraging Because what this translates to all of us is, so while we may be focused on the TV debates, we may be focused on all the drama and the theatrics of TV news debates, it's actually not contributing much to the public discourse. In fact, it suggests that people are looking at that more as entertainment rather than as a source of news, which is very, very encouraging for us as a democracy. So people still focus on newspapers, and that's very, very optimistic for us. But here's the troubling statistic. And it's troubling because it involves the younger generation. 290 million people in India use social media on a daily basis. That's 30 crore people use social media on a daily basis. And 35% of them use social media as the primary source of news. Now, this is really troubling because 80% of this demographic are millennials and Generation Z. So we're talking of the youth of our country, the middle-aged up to the ages of 40, the middle-aged people. This is 80% of those who are active on social media. And a big chunk of them rely exclusively on social media for news. Now, this is troubling at many levels. It's troubling because, unlike newspapers, there is no process to read information, process information as news versus opinion. Second, you have platforms like Facebook and YouTube, which the algorithms work so that they reinforce your own biases. They give you what you like to read. They reinforce your fears. And so you have a global outcry, starting from the United States elections to even in India, against organizations, technology platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and Google. In fact, you'll be surprised to hear that some of the most highly paid executives in these technology companies serve as public policy directors, where their only role is to sort of influence public policy so that their technology platforms can have reach and influence people. Now, why is social media important to democracy? It's important because if you go back to the definition of democracy, of the general will of the people that we talked about, the definition of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he says that the population needs to have access to adequate information. So let's assume that the print media gives you access to adequate information. Second, you deliberate. Let's even give the benefit of the doubt to television journalists and say you create a platform where there is robust debate and public debate. So the people have information, the people have a public debate. But there's a third very critical part for the general will, which is after that, people aren't supposed to speak to each other. The population isn't supposed to communicate with each other, which is very easy to achieve until social media. There was no way to actually have political discourse between unrelated persons before social media. There was no way to comment on an article. There was no way to share an article. There was no way to like an article. There was no way to have bots to like or dislike articles or YouTube videos. Now, what this is doing is it's influencing people to stop thinking as individuals, but to start thinking as communities. We go back to one person, one vote. And you see how dangerous this is. For example, if you are a senior in your law firm and you post an article which is supporting a particular political ideology, will your junior not be compelled or influenced to also form a similar point of view? And this is across the board. So there's pressure formed, and it ultimately takes away from your human right to make up your own mind. And we are giving up that right to have a collective thinking, which is very dangerous because then it's no longer one person, one vote. It is one faction, one vote. So if you come from a particular community, you will vote in a particular way. If you come from a particular locality, you will vote in a particular way. If you come from a particular age group, you'll vote in a particular way. If you come from a particular social strata, economic strata, you will vote in a particular way. And this is a fraud on democracy. It's a fraud on democracy because the individual right to express your will in the ballot is taken away by a community right to vote. And the one development which is to really blame for this is social media. Now, even if you look at Facebook, and let's assume that Facebook is able to clean up its act, and let's assume that all information is being made available in Facebook. Let's treat Facebook as a newspaper vendor who's coming and giving you the news. They're only a platform. There's other content that's coming in. Two other concerns that we have. One, you and I can now create content. You don't need to be a journalist to create content. So people are consuming fake news, and technology has moved so much that you can take genuine videos. There's something called deep fake news. You should sort of research on that if you have the time, where you can create videos that look so lifelike and it's completely fake. So you have the ability to create content, to create news, although you don't have a press pass, you don't have a press accreditation, you haven't gone through an editorial process. And secondly, you are able to comment and to influence the way people consume the same piece of news. The same piece of news could be consumed and marketed in a way that suits a different perspective. So under these circumstances, I do believe the time is right for law, the judiciary, and the media to work together to come up with a framework to uphold democracy. Just like you cannot have unqualified lawyers and judges giving out justice, you cannot have organizations without any accreditation being able to share information as news. Everybody, yes, has the right to share information, but to share it as news is dangerous for our country. And with that, it's the time is 5:45. I'm just going to leave you with one quotation, and I hope you have been able to think of media, social media, and democracy, and how it all fits into our right to determine, our right to self-determine. And I'll leave you with this quote by Harry F. Banks, which says, "An informed people is one of the best guarantees of a continuing democracy. An informed people is one of the best guarantees of a continuing democracy." With that, I will leave it open for any questions that you have.